Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of our podcast, Adoption and Beyond. My name is Nicole Fowler. I'm the Director of Social Services at Adoptions from the Heart and the co-host for today's podcast.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elise White, Social Service Program Manager at Adoptions from the Heart, and the other co host of this podcast.
Welcome. We are so excited for today's episode. We have two great guests who will be sharing their experiences as adoptees and therapists.
Yes, first we have Jennifer Kahn. Jennifer is a psychotherapist and licensed social worker who specializes in working with young people. She was adopted from South Korea when she was just 2 years old. Jennifer has worked with children in the foster care system, counseling children living with foster parents, as well as adoptees. Welcome, Jennifer.
Hello, nice to be here.
Thank you for coming. We appreciate it. And we also have Jessica Ann Pressler as a guest. Jessica is an author, psychotherapist, and social worker. She is a Columbia University alumni with a master's in clinical social work. She is licensed in both New Jersey and in California as an LCSW. Jessica Pressler is also an adoptee. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me here and be able to join into this discussion.
Before we get started with our conversation with Jessica and Jennifer, we'd like to start with our What's Buzzing segment. Myra, what do you have for us today?
Hi, everyone. So now we're going to move into our What's Bussing segment. You guys may notice that we're wearing different clothes, and that is because we're recording this at another time, but we wanted to bring this segment to make sure that we're sharing this information with you guys. So, Bo and Elise, today I have for you an article. It is from People's Magazine, where they're speaking about the whole situation with YouTuber Micah Stauffer. I'm not sure if our audience is aware of what happened in 2020 with Micah Stafford, but she is a vlogger, a daily vlogger, family blogger, and she vlogged her family. She decided to adopt a child from China, and then there were some medical problems that came up, and while she said she was very aware of these problems and prepared for them, a few years after she decided to rehome this child. So I will put in the link for this article, so for anyone that doesn't know the history of what happened, everything that went down with this, they can read it and kind of understand what happened. But the reason why this is resurfacing is because there is a docu-series that's going to be coming out, just going through the whole history and all of the different reasons and things that happened from both sides. So we are going to be on the lookout to watch this and just learn more about the situation. But just as social workers, Alice and Nicole, I want to hear from you guys about rehoming. As adoption social workers, what is your opinion? What is your what advice do you have for parents that maybe feeling like they took on an adoption and then now they don't feel like they're prepared, or maybe their agency didn't prepare them for all the different sides or all the different things that could come up with an adoption. So I just want to hear from you guys, your experience and what you think about this.
Yeah, this is a tough one. I mean, I think first and foremost, it's so important as an agency to really place value on education and educating our prospective adoptive parents. And for anyone listening that may be thinking about adopting or maybe in the process of adopting, also take it into your own hands to make sure that you feel fully prepared for any situation that you are open to. I think that most agencies, I would hope, are doing a good job educating their families, but it's also on those individuals to make sure they feel fully prepared. And if they don't, there's a lot of other avenues to educate yourself if you don't feel like you're getting that from your agency. That's the first piece I'd like to say to this. And then just the idea of rehoming, I think we all hate that term for starters because this is a child. It's an individual, it's a person. This is not a thing or an object that we control.
Exactly, Elise. The term rehoming can seem focused on things rather than humans. But always at the end of the day, we want what's best for the child. So if worst case scenario, what needs to be done, that's best for the child, but trying to avoid all of these traumatic incidents beforehand and rehoming beforehand, which is starting with education. And I love what you said about parents taking that into their own hands if they're not provided. And I know it's such an exciting time to try and build your family through adoption, but really taking into consideration the consequences of that trauma on a child and what that can lead to. And whether you have child biologically or through adoption or through foster care, through guardianship, there are all sorts of things that can happen. But there's an especially extra traumatic piece that comes with adoption as well, and loss that comes with adoption. So when we're going through, we know everybody's excited during the home study and waiting process. It's not just arbitrary education that we're expecting and requiring of adoptive families, because these are the realities that unfortunately children face. And instances of rehoming have made it harder for adoptive families open to adopting domestically or internationally, make it harder for people who are prepared to take on challenges of any child that comes to them. It makes it a harder process, but that's why we require so much education and taking that time to really consider what is best for your family. And again, things come up no matter how you grow your family. So this is not just an adoption thing. This is how you grow your family anyway.
Yeah, Nicole, I mean, you made a great point that we as an agency, but hopefully also all of prospective adoptive families and adoptive families are coming from this as a really child-centered and child-focused place. And ultimately, while rehoming should always be a last resort, we always want what's best for a child. And it's very clear if that child was in a home that didn't seem fit to parent, that the best case scenario is for that child to go to a home and a family that is equipped to parent and love that child fully. So while rehoming is never a first option, a second option, a third option, if it is what's best for the child, then I would hope any agency would be behind that decision.
Thank you so much for your feedback on this and for sharing a little bit more. I think what you said, education is just so important, and just to know what are the challenges that could come up with an adoption, and knowing that when to ask for help when you need it in these cases. So thank you so much for your words, for your insight, and we can go back now to our conversation.
I'd like to move on to our conversation with our guests. As mentioned earlier, Jessica and Jennifer are both adoptees who are also both psychotherapists. We're thrilled to learn more about their personal and professional stories. I would love to just know, if you don't mind, if you could share a little bit, both of you, about your own personal journey as an adoptee, and also how that may have influenced your work as a psychotherapist as well.
My adoptive story starts off not the way you're supposed to do it. When I was not told I was adopted till I was almost 10 years old, and I was adopted as an infant. And when I was told in my favorite spot in Indian Lake, New York, in the Adirondacks. And I was told very briefly, we're just letting you know that you were adopted. What does that mean, mommy? What does it mean, daddy? I didn't even understand. I was 9. And they said, well, you were birthed by someone else and we took you in. But I want you to know that we could have sent you back, but we didn't. And then they said, okay, it's time for breakfast. And we went up and they never brought it up again. And so we didn't discuss it for a couple of years. And I had a dream that I was adopted a couple of years later when I was about 12. I asked them if it was real. Oh, I forgot the other piece they said. They also told me, I think I said, what happened to my mommy and daddy? And they said they both died. Your mom died in childbirth, and your father died in the Vietnam War, which I don't even think worked, by the way, in regard to timing, but who knows when you're 9 years old. So I also went believing that I killed my mother because she died in childbirth. So I'm left with this information, and they didn't speak about it again. So when I was 12, I said I had a dream and I think I'm adopted. Is that true? Or was it just a dream? And they told me that I was adopted. They did answer the question. And then they did tell me that they don't know who my father is, but my mother is possibly alive. So it was a lie. And then I, didn't really talk about it with them, but I remember living a life of being in a classroom and seeing strange people coming to the door. And I'm like, are you my mommy? Are you checking up on me? I mean, I'm even tearful now as I say it. And, but couldn't really discuss it with anyone. Now, my mother was a judge and my dad was a lawyer, and I was feeling very guilty about making them feel not wanted or not. So I didn't really want to bring it up, but I did ask my father when I was 18 if he could try to get my records opened. And so he did. He went to the court and went to a social worker, and she opened the records, took down a piece of information, closed the records, and gave it back to the court. Basically, nothing was right, but nothing was true in the records except the aunt and uncle, Harriet, her name was Harriet, took my natural mother, my birth mother, in when she was pregnant. And I wound up connecting with them when I was 18, and then waited for her to tell Harriet, my birth mother, that I existed. But I waited patiently because she said that she was going through a tough time. She didn't know how she was going to handle it. And I waited 7 years before she actually told her, but kept communication with them. And then met my birth mother very briefly when I was 25 and had a child of my own. When I met her, she answered a few questions, and then I never saw her again until 25 years later when I started coming to California, and then went to see her. But she had not told anyone I existed. Her husband never knew. So I would visit her. I would pretend that I was daughter of a friend of hers, and I would bring my kids to, because my family knew. It was part of my life, but it wasn't part of hers. So we would come in, we would take these pictures, but no one knew. It was a very bizarre situation. She died a year ago. And after she died, she also had 2 daughters with this husband. And a month ago, I told them about me. So this is the new piece. They were very receptive. The sad part is because she felt whatever she felt, it was shame or whatever was going on with her not telling. They said to me that after we, made the connection and all the emotion that went with that, they said that if they wish they had known, because it explained, that gave them peace or an understanding of why she was who she was, which seemed to be maybe a cold and depressed person throughout their life. And it's just sad because it couldn't be open. It was a different time period. I'm 59 years old. And at that time there wasn't, the knowledge. I believe that piece, among other things that happened in my childhood, was traumatic for me and was a part of the reason why I, as an adult, had difficulty in romantic relationships when it came to abandonment. Any questions?
Thank you so much for sharing. I think you answered a lot of questions that came up during that time. I really appreciate you sharing with that. I'm curious how the differences between, you said 59 years ago to now, how that's influenced your work as a psychotherapist and how that's influenced your life as well.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I stood strong that when it came to me, my adoption did not do so. It clearly did for many years. I was an infant and I grew up in somewhat of a privileged, I had the things that I needed, but I had a difficult relationship with my mother because she was very consumed with her work and she didn't connect easily from her own issues. So I kind of just said, okay, the adoption, and realizing, of course, that wasn't true, that my adoption was a big piece on why I had abandonment issues. Not in any other relationship, by the way, except for my romantic ones. But that's where that intimacy is where it played. And with that understanding and seeing other people that came to me as a therapist and also friends, that the families that did tell their child young, that did express love and safety, that they felt that they weren't going. I mean, that the message to me was, we could send you back anytime. They said it. These were their words. It's what not to do when you have, you adopt a child. That I never had that safety. I think safety when you're a child, being unconditionally loved, knowing that your needs are met, but not just your things, because my things were met, my basic needs, but that I was safe because I didn't have to worry that I was going to be abandoned by my own family. So the importance of that in childhood. And I think that a lot of adoptees have that fear, even if it's done correctly, and but how important it is for parents to reassure their child that they are loved, and at every age, tell them when they're young and make it part of their life. So the people that I know that it was like that did cope better and coped better in their relationships as adults.
It's interesting that you said even when it's done correctly, because all adoption has some piece of grief and loss to it, even if it's the most beautiful of circumstances and the most open and transparent of circumstances. So I certainly appreciate you saying that this can affect many different circumstances, but it sounded like yours were particularly tough. And I really appreciate you sharing this with us and our listeners now, and hopefully giving some tools to move through those things. I was wondering, Jennifer, if you had any similar stories or if you wanted to share with us what tell us about you.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for sharing that, Jessica. That was a really enlightening and moving story. I do a lot of work with adoptees, and there's a lot of familiarity with the things that you mentioned, and I'm sure we'll touch on some of those themes and some of those issues during this discussion. And it's interesting because it also reminded me how unique each story is, right? When you see someone on the street, you don't necessarily know that they're adopted, that they have this background. And I think it's important that we're not a monolith and we're not seen that way, because we all have so many different experiences. For me personally, I had a very different experience than Jessica, right? So I was adopted at about 2.5 years old from South Korea. And due to the poverty situation there, many Koreans were adopted out to countries in Europe, as well as America. Most people are familiar with that. And as I was growing up, I had 3 older siblings, and they were all non-adopted. So they were all Caucasian and related to biologically to my parents. So that was a very different, right? So there was no reveal to me that I was adopted, because it was pretty obvious that I did not look like anyone else. And I was the youngest of 4. So I was also raised, I don't know if you had siblings, Jessica, but it also makes a difference depending on how you're raised.
So when I was told I was adopted, I was also told my mother was pregnant.
So they decided to give you all the news at once. A lot to process as a 9-year-old, I can imagine. So I was raised with 3 older non-adopted siblings. And I think you had a good quotation for that. Even the good ones, the way that you could be raised, you're still going to have a lot of issues. I would probably count myself as one of those really fortunate ones. I was brought into a family that, despite being Caucasian and very different from me in many ways, we're incredibly open to communication, to talking about being adopted, to celebrating my adoption, to celebrating me as a human being different than they are. They were excited to try Korean food. They were excited to share with me Korean folk stories, or even stories beyond my own experience, right? So when I was first adopted, my mother's thought was, well, she's not going to look like my other children, and I don't want to get her a doll that looks like my other children, because the first thing that she'll think is I have to look like that. She wasn't wrong. And so she actually couldn't find an Asian doll. It was 1975. So she found a really cute black doll, and she got that for me. And I loved that doll so much, and we were very close. But the whole point is that she took an intentional effort to think about what it might be like for me. And I think that's part of what Jessica and I both are understanding as adult adoptees. I'm 51, that it matters so much how our parents, first of all, talk to us about our adoption, reveal to us what our status might be, but also take the time to be really open to the fact that our experience is something they can't understand. So they can't dictate to us how to experience it. So part of what I got from Jessica's story was that she was told this information in a way that sort of dictated how she should respond to it emotionally. And leading up, throughout my life, I found that my desire to work with children who are adopted became more and more at the forefront as I became more comfortable with my own story. So despite being raised in a really loving family, and I'm incredibly close with everyone in my family, including my siblings, I of course went through identity issues. I of course went through issues considering, where did I come from? How was I conceived? Jessica just brought up some really interesting points about the trauma inflection of how we may have been conceived, how we may have been abandoned or given up, and how we have to create and fill that void. We have to create a story for ourselves. When I was younger, my story was that I must have been royalty, and therefore I was, it was a fairy tale. I had to be absconded through a castle, and then I found my way, right? So I'm left with a void where I can only create a fantasy, and that's not a satisfying place to be. after I went to college and I worked for a while, I decided to go get my social work degree. And I had no intention of being a therapist. But I went to Korea when I was 40 years old. I finally went back with my husband, and I had such an amazing experience visiting my orphanage, finding nothing about my biological family. I had no great story to tell, and finding that satisfying. Finding it satisfying to say, I can find culture, I can find identity from my past, but I don't have to find all of these answers. I can actually live in the life that I have now, and I can be happy in that place. But there was this need, after meeting all of these international adoptees, there was this need to actually work with children who have been adopted. So my current practice, I work with, I would say about half of my clients are adoptees, and they range in age from currently from about 12 to their 50s. And it's fascinating to work with adoptees in that broad of a range. And I can see so much. And some of them are internationally adopted. Some of them have differences in race. Some of them are not. Some of them are domestic adoptions. So I find it so interesting to talk about these issues that adoptees face, that regardless of whether or not you're Caucasian, adopted into a Caucasian family, whether or not you're a multiracial family, whether or not you had a good experience, or whether you had a really tough experience, that a lot of these issues that we're going to talk about today are incredibly common. And I found them to be a through line from preteen all the way into adulthood.
It is time now for Ask Anything segment. Thank you everyone who has submitted a question. If you want your questions answered in the future, just make sure that you leave us a comment on YouTube or answer our poll on Spotify. You could also message us at Adoptions from the Heart on any of our social media platforms, and we will make sure to answer the questions. So, okay, this question that we have today is from Vanessa. Vanessa is an adoptee, and she said, "Hi, I'm an adoptee and I need support. I want to connect with other adoptees. What are some resources or support that AFDH offers for adoptees?"
That's a great question. AFTH actually hosts an adoptee support group. It's hosted monthly. It is virtual, so anyone from any state can attend. And if anybody's interested in that, it can be found right on our website, afth.org, under the calendar of events.
Yes, thank you for sharing that, Elise. And I want to mention it's led by social workers who are also adoptees. So they're coming in with their own experiences through adoption. This is a new support group, so we're still exploring how it works best for adoptees. Right now, it is for ages 15 plus.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. And let's just get back to our conversation.
Thank you for sharing that, Jennifer. And to both of you, what I find so interesting is that adoption, no matter, like Nicole said, how it starts, how it begins, what the middle looks like, there's going to be some trauma involved, no matter what. And so I am curious for each of you, did you have to do some trauma work before taking on counseling others? And if so, what did that look like for you? What was that journey sort of like in sort of self-discovery for you?
Well, my self-discovery when it came to the trauma wound from adoption wasn't till relatively recently. As I said, I didn't admit that I had a trauma from my adoption. I focused mostly on my relationship with my mother that raised me by the process of writing the book that I wrote and doing all the work I am with trauma. As a therapist, obviously, the adoption played an important role. I always helped people with trauma. I just didn't recognize in myself the adoption piece, or if I recognized it, it was more about how they told me. It was what we just discussed, when in reality, being adopted by itself is something that, you have to work through. And as I mentioned before, even as a child looking around the streets. I mean, I don't know how you feel, Jennifer, but the book, Are You My Mother? Was my book. And that was, when I read it to my kids, I don't think I read it until I read it to my children, like, oh my God, that's me. And I would go around looking, are you my mother? Are you my mother? And I wasn't looking for a replacement. Even the complicated relationship I had with the mother, that raised me, I just was trying to figure out who I was, because the genetic component is still part of me. And I didn't look like my parents. I mean, I looked more like my parents than probably you felt you did, Jennifer, but I didn't look like my parents. And I definitely, for various reasons, felt invisible in the family. So to answer your question, I didn't do the work that I needed to do until very recently in regard to adoption when helping others. I understand it very well now.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's very common actually to wait till you're much older. I did mention that despite having an amazing childhood and upbringing and being very open about my adoption and celebrating that, I didn't go back to Korea till I was 40 years old because I didn't want to, right? So my parents offered me as a college gift, oh, we're going to send you back to Korea whenever you're ready. We're going to just, you can take your sister, you can take a friend, you can do whatever you want, but whenever you're ready. And I was 21 years old, and it took me another 20 years before I was ready. So in terms of the work that you asked about, I think I was doing the work during my 20s and 30s, though I may not have quite realized it. I did see therapists. I did seek out an understanding of why I had attachment issues, why I had abandonment issues. I had this incredibly solid, incredibly supportive family. My parents stayed together, are happily married. I had all of these siblings. I had friends. I was pretty well adjusted, and I couldn't understand why I was struggling with this fear that I couldn't quite identify. So I did have to do some of that work. And some of that also came from, I think, going back and getting my social work degree and starting some of that work of trauma and where that comes from, and social development and psychological development and child development. And all of that fascinates me so much. And I think maybe in part it fascinates you, Jessica, because we're seeking answers. We're seeking answers as to those empty pieces of ourselves that we can't quite figure out why. And we don't want to just look at our environment and say, oh, it must be this, or it must be that I'm adopted. We're all incredibly complex and nuanced beings. But I did do that work, and I found it really helpful. I also found that I'm a CBT specialist. So I work on cognitive behavioral therapy, which I find very helpful for adoptees in particular, because a lot of what they lack is this sense of identity of who am I. So one of the first things that we do is we talk about their values, and they have a sense of, well, I have my values that I got from my family, but I also have this other identity. And maybe it has to do with race. Maybe it has to do with not knowing their background. Maybe it has to do with something else. But they feel this sense of disconnect or longing for more connection. And I think that has helped me help adoptees in my work. But I will say, and I think Jessica also could speak to this, but I find it very healing to do my work. And I don't know if that's because I'm an adoptee and because I've dealt with these issues myself, but I think it's also something that is a form of giving back for me. I feel immense gratitude for the life that I've had, regardless of whatever hardships I've experienced. And so to me, the best way to feel satisfied in that regard is to actually give back to others who've had similar experiences, or find some healing with those people, even through hearing their stories, even through understanding, widening my perspective a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same way. I did not focus on adoption per se, but I did focus on trauma. What I'm doing now, the book I wrote, the social media thing I'm doing, everything I'm doing now is to give back, to take what I've learned and what I've experienced, and part of which is being adopted. But it's the trauma from what happens in your childhood and before you're even born, and helping others. So I completely agree.
Thank you for that. I'm of the belief that everybody would benefit from therapy, everybody would benefit from counseling when it comes to children. And I know there's different, developmental stages. And what do you suggest is the first start of that? And this can be trauma related and or adoption related. It doesn't have to be specific to adoptees. And I know that probably takes the maturity of parents into account as well. What do you suggest to parents with their children?
Well, I would just say there's so many, and we could have an entire series of podcasts on, how to help adoptive parents with adopted children. But I work with adoptees' parents. When they're minors, I will be working with their parents sort of in conjunction with the work that I do with adoptees. And I think there's so many things that Jessica has brought up that actually echo the work that I've done. So part of the patterns I've seen is that children really struggle when, of course, there's a trauma in the fact that they were adopted. There can be additional layers of trauma after that, having to do with their own home environment, having to do with how they cope or how they assimilate, or even possibly any other kind of trauma that they experience that's completely unrelated to the fact that they're adopted. But regardless, they're dealing with trauma. And I find that when I'm working with young children, that they are mostly in denial about the fact that adoption has anything to do with why they're upset or unhappy. Right. So the first thing that you have to do is actually kind of break through that wall of parents sometimes being in denial, right? Like the love that they feel for their children is so great and they've given so much that they hate the idea that their children are suffering, right? So the first thing you have to do is break through that wall of it's okay to acknowledge that this was a trauma, that your child is experiencing hardship, and it's not anyone's fault. It's not the child's fault, and it's not your fault as adoptive parents. You're not doing something wrong per se. On the other hand, I see patterns where children don't adjust well. The worst adjustment is when they are given inconsistent messaging, like Jessica described, when they are essentially emotionally cut off from exploration of this stunning news, when they're given no outlet to essentially explore their identity freely, right? So they're being told, no, this is your life. You're lucky, be here. Everything else doesn't matter. And if we tell you some little story, it's okay if it doesn't, all the facts aren't right. Meanwhile, as human beings, we have an instinctive need to know where we come from, how we were created, why we're here, and what is our purpose now that we have been shifted from where we were supposed to be to where we are now. And I think that when you're young, children want to avoid any of that processing, and parents kind of are like, okay, let's not talk about it, right? We have enough to deal with. We don't need to bring this stuff up. My kid doesn't want to bring it up. So my first suggestion for parents is to kind of resist that instinct and that urge to go the quote unquote easy route, because what you're avoiding are conversations that are going to be necessary. It doesn't matter if they're 100 years old. They're still going to be seeking answers to those questions. They're still going to be dealing with that trauma. And I think that trauma for adopted children isn't so dissimilar. It has its own unique, cohort, but it's not so dissimilar than the trauma that you may work on with any of your clients. And in terms of their reactions. So one of the things I do teach my parents is that there are trauma reactions. There is flight, fight, freeze, and one that they're not very familiar with, which is fawn. And that's placation. And when you are placating as an adoptee, you are in a trauma response of fawning, terrified that you may be given back, you may not be satisfactory, that you actually take on a posture of fawning as a trauma response for your whole life. And that will also speak to adult romantic abandonment issues that seem to crop up with almost every adoptee that I work. Sorry, go ahead, Jessica.
No, I'm agreeing. I was a fawner and went into my romantic, I had to be the good girl. I was the silent one. I was also told the message in my family also was I was too sensitive. So I was invisible. I had to be quiet, and you learn to cope. And because I didn't want to be sent back, because that was my message. I just didn't want to be sent back. And you talk about, working with family. I did family therapy. It is very important that when you're working with children, that you also work with the parents. You can't put that child back in that family without the parents knowing, what to do. And then the other issue I think that comes up too is children don't want to be different than others. So that's also another component. And shame. You must do incredible work, Jennifer, with what in helping these. I mean, I wish I knew you. Well, you had to have been older, but I wish I knew you when I was younger. You would have really helped me.
Well, it's amazing that you bring that up, because I think shame is the key word here, right? And where does shame come from? It comes from a place where we don't have answers. And so we can only internalize that shame toward ourselves, right? So it must have been my fault my parents got divorced. It must have been they didn't explain to me what happened, so it must have been something I did. It must have been my fault that I was actually abandoned, right? There can actually be an adoptee perspective of what did I do wrong to be left behind and then adopted. And I think that shame is something that's so difficult for young children. So they try to transmogrify it into very different channels, right? Some might try and control their eating. Some might try and control their social situations. Some might just try and placate their families to a degree that they are now labeled the too sensitive one. But these are all trauma responses, and that type of psychoeducation is really important for parents. But the truth is that I think is sometimes unspoken is some parents don't want to hear it. And there are some parents who are simply unwilling to acknowledge that their children's adoptive status and their journey and their background actually does cause them pain and suffering, and that they have to deal with it. And so I think there are times when I struggle with working with families that don't want to see it, and they bring to bear their own familial issues, right? So just because you're an adoptive parent doesn't mean you don't bring your own shame or your own, insecurities or anger issues or whatever you might have coming into it. So I think there's so many layers that adoptees have to deal with, but the beginning of the healthiest trajectory is always going to be the thing that actually disinfects shame, which is truth and honesty, and which is sharing with that child. None of this is your fault. None of this is about anything you've done. And I know you feel this way, and I know this must be hard, and you must be confused. And I don't have all the answers, but I'm here to talk to you about it anytime you want. And so that's a different way to approach it, rather than, well, as parents, we want to fix things for our kids. And when we feel like we can't, sometimes we back away.
And you can't change the truth here. So you have to work with it. You can't make the child not adopted. You have to, but you can make the experience full of love and unconditional love. And I always believe that when children feel safe and loved, it's really the foundation, of everything else to come.
And it's very complicated when we talk about shame when it comes to young people trying to find their own identity. So I'll give you one example of a client I work with, and she's a 23-year-old Latin American adoptee. And she was raised in a family as an only child, and they're Catholic and Caucasian. And they raised her very much to just be a part of their family. But they never really recognized her Latina-ness or her Latina identity. Not only are their politics quite different, and that has created its own problems over the last, I'd say, 5 or 6 years, 8 years maybe at this point, but she made one decision that really upset them. And the decision was to take back her birth name. And she's a beautiful birth name. And I encouraged her in whatever way that you can bring that identity closer to yourself and feel more integrated, that's a positive thing. They reacted very badly to her deciding to go back to her birth name, to the point which they actually said, we will not leave you, and she's an only child, we will not leave you your rightful inheritance if you are under a different name.
Oh my goodness.
And that's the level of extremes that you can find where parents can't accept their child's quest for identity. So when we talk about fear and shame of children, that's what they're afraid of. They're afraid of that second rejection, right? I've already been rejected once, can't afford it again. But if I attempt to search out my own identity and really build that up, my therapist says I should. What if my parents actually reject that and tell me, no, that's not okay?
I mean, I worried about also not talking about it with them because I didn't want to hurt them. But I'm sure that next piece was, I don't want to hurt them and I don't want to be rejected. Both parts. And you stay silent and don't tell anybody.
You bring up a great point, Jessica, in adoptees often not wanting to hurt their adoptive parents' feelings by asking questions, which is natural. It's natural for children to ask questions about everything, but specifically about their adoption story. What advice, if any, do either of you have for adoptive parents specifically in helping to create a really supportive environment for their children to be able to ask questions, especially for those parents that may err on the side of, let's not bring it up if our child's not bringing it up? Do you have any suggestions for folks that are going through that?
I'll guess because I don't work just with adoptees, so I'm sure you'll be able to give a better answer, Jennifer, but I'll just say that creating an environment that, every once in a while check in with them and say, I'm here for you. I'm going to, it just be loving and unconditional about it. And I'm here if you want to speak, maybe, if you want to see a therapist, I can find you a therapist, a book, depending on the ages. There's a ton of books out there, which again, I don't know them, but Jennifer, I'm sure you and you guys all would know, but just to make it okay, normalize it. And no matter what, be where their child is. don't project your own view, because everyone, experiences things differently. But I believe that with any of the therapy that I do, you be where the person is and don't impose yourself. You don't project your own needs onto them.
Yeah, I think that's actually and really good advice for parents in general. We could all use that advice. I think you bring up a really good point, which is, an environment that's loving and supportive is going to be the first thing that you want to build, regardless. And normalizing the idea of adoption and being adopted looks slightly different, though, right? Because you have to normalize it while not putting it as something that we don't talk about, or something that we just kind of sweep under the rug, or we don't acknowledge, which is easier when you're the same race. But I've had people who are people of color adoptees who also feel very awkward and that their parents don't handle it particularly well. But I think that one of the ways to quote unquote normalize that as we talk about it is to actually draw attention to it. Right. So things can only be normal if we talk about them, if we're open about them, and if they're kind of fully integrated into the experience of growing up. So what do I mean by that? So maybe that would look like as you're growing up, you do have a celebration of their adoption day. That's not something my parents did, by the way, and I didn't miss it. But at the same time, I hear about it, and I'm like, that's so cool. But they found other ways to make me feel like this was something both open to be talked about, an open subject, but also something to be celebrated, because I, as a person, becoming a part of their family is something to celebrate. I think that you have to create opportunities for your children to engage with the fact of being adopted without forcing them. So what does that mean? Like, it could be something like, oh, I heard about this really cool adoptee camp. Are you interested? They may say no. But what they're hearing from you is, I see and hear that you're adopted. I know that your experience is different. I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about who you are, the same way I would think about it if you told me you had something about your identity that made you unique. I'd want to find things that helped you feel like you fit in. The other thing I would do for international adoptees is I would not just focus on their particular background and say, okay, now we got to learn everything we can about Korea. That's great too. But sometimes kids will rebel against that. That's too much of me being different. I don't want to focus on my differences. So another way to open that up is to have more of kind of an international kind of approach, which is we like to try all different kinds of foods. We like to travel to different places. We like to read books by people from Senegal, as well as, Dominican Republic, to actually have a more sort of global approach to the way you read books, you eat foods, you travel, you talk about things, you talk about current events, so that they don't feel that they're living in a world that's only whatever small suburban town or city or, block that they live on, that they feel that diversity in and of itself is not something that's scary or something that we should be afraid of. It's something we should embrace. And that's actually the American ethos, right? That we're all immigrants and then we've all come here for a better life. I think the love and support, the environment that Jessica talks about is absolutely crucial. And I think that through normalizing it, you're actually bringing light to it, but in a light kind of way, rather than this sense of, if I bring this up, it'll be dark. It'll make my parents upset.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want that. So then they'll pick up on those things. So as much as my parents offered for me to do and to get involved in, and we went to every adoptee picnic, and right, I know a lot of your adoptee families go to the AFTH picnic. Anything you can do that tells your adopted kid, whether they accept it or not at that moment, we see you. We know that you're having a different experience, and we care about that. And we may not know everything, but we're going to grow and we're going to learn with you. And we're going to do everything we can as parents to give you the opportunity to grow and learn yourself.
And what great advice for any parent to any child.
Yes. Yes, I agree. And in adoption, there's also, from what I understand from prospective adoptive parents, this fear surrounding, okay, I want to provide a loving, supportive environment. We're adding a whole other family potentially through open adoption. As adoptees and mental health professionals, how do you feel about open adoption and its benefits for adoptees?
I think that if everyone is on board, it could be beautiful. Again, it's normalizing it. It sounds like, it's all about love and inclusion. And just with, I mean, it's a little different, but with the ideal it's a situation where people get divorced, but if people are work together and they're, and the children feel loved by everyone, that's, the same advice of not saying anything poor about the other parent, you would do that in this situation as well. And if you incorporate the other all the parents, the more the merrier, the more love, ideally. But what do you think? Because Jennifer, because you work with the actual, I'm sure, open adoptions.
Well, I actually have a client currently who is from an open adoption, and she had a much more complex case. And I think it's like all adoptees, everyone's different. Every situation's different. So there's a unique circumstances for every single human being, right? And in this case, the open adoption did not work out well for the young woman. And she chose, in fact, part of why I was brought in was because she was struggling with the fact that they were having these family meetings, but she couldn't really express herself about how she felt about it. And this is a unique case because the biological parents went on to have more children and stayed together. So when they came together, it was facing the fact that you have biological parents who you've been told they couldn't provide for you. However, here they are with two of your siblings who are being provided for. So it was a very confusing situation. So I think every situation is unique. I think, like Jessica says, open adoption can be a wonderful thing. And I know so many families that it has been really a wonderful situation. So I think it depends on each circumstance. However, it's still, I think, a positive story because no one can predict how people are going to behave or how children are going to react when they grow up. But what their parents did was they adapted. They thought what would be best is for their daughter to see her biological parents and siblings regularly. And that turned out not to be the case for them. And they actually adjusted. They found me. I have been working with her for now several years. And she made a decision, and I helped her relay that to her parents. We had a family therapy session where she did express that she didn't want to have contact with her birth mother anymore. And that was her decision. And they respected it and they supported it. And she's moved on. And it may be that someday she wants to think about being in contact with them. It may be, she's also biracial. So she has many layers to deal with, right? So she was biracial and adopted, and she had that family also in her life. So part of what I would say is that each and every instance is going to be so unique that we have to just look at the dynamics and what is going to be in the best interest of the child.
And I think that what's so wonderful is that there can be changes, that nothing is stagnant, that you can actually adjust, that they came to you and they adjusted to make it more comfortable for her, right?
Yes. And that's exactly right. She adjusted because they adjusted. So she was able to process and feel supported.
Listen to her. Good.
Something we counsel with our adoptive parents too is your child is going to be of an age to express their opinion and to express that, but being able to show them from the beginning that you're trying to create this inclusive environment through open adoption. And then later we can figure out maybe some struggles and challenges with that, but at least starting the relationship that way. And I hope that she felt more confident that her family tried to produce this loving and open environment for her.
And I think that's part of what we're talking about, right? There's so many great intentions. I think most people involved in adoption are people who have wonderful intentions. And I think when we keep it child-centered and when we give them the knowledge and the ability to know age appropriately things about their past, their identity, where they come from, and we give them the right to have autonomy. So part of what we're talking about when we create identity is our sense of self-efficacy or autonomy. So if I don't feel I'm capable of presenting myself as a person who's going to be listened to and who has the right to speak, we have real trouble creating full identities. So for young people who are adopted, they need to feel heard, and they have such a loss of control by being adopted. This happened to you. You're here. Be good, or you might be sent back, is kind of the message that we sometimes give ourselves or we actually hear. So if that's the case, then the best thing that adoptees can do is develop some amount of autonomy and have their parents say, you know what, you know better than us. We respect you. You take the lead on this decision. And that gives them that sense that they can actually know who they are and be okay with that.
And I think validating their feelings is so important. in that
Definitely.
process. And parents could admit they're wrong at times, that maybe I thought you were going to feel this way, or I thought we were doing this way, but they listen, they validate their feelings, and again, adjust accordingly, because it's trial and error for everyone, every relationship.
And Jessica, you're right. It's so important as a parent to tell our kids when we've made a mistake and to say sorry and to admit that. I'm super curious, Jennifer, because you were talking a little bit about, of course, adoptees and finding their own identity, and you yourself being adopted transracially, but also internationally. For children that are adopted that may be a different race of their own adoptive family, do you feel like that adds another layer of trying to find their own identity and their journey to their self-identity?
I absolutely do. And I don't think it's about better or worse. I just think
Mhm.
it's a very unique experience to be adopted as a person of color into a family that's a different race, and to experience your life within that racial culture.
Mhm.
So, for instance, for me, I always kind of joke about how I was really raised with white privilege. And yet, when people see me, they don't assume that that's going to be my persona. To be honest, most people assume that I'm going to be quiet and meek. They're very surprised when I start talking. But that's the part of the whole point, right? Is that as adoptees, we have things that are sort of assumed about us. And we have to overcome racial stereotypes. We have to overcome our sense of, do we belong to this group? And if we want to belong to another group, will they even accept us? When I got to college, I wanted to join the Korean Association, but they did not really want me to. And I felt that. And I was like, okay, we're not going to jive, well, I'm not Korean. So at the end of the day, there's so much more identity that has to be explored. And then you also have to deal with racism. And a lot of what I deal with I would say, adoptees who are in their 20s and 30s, who have dealt with and have not been able to process how they dealt with growing up in fairly racist environments, whether it was what we call microaggressions or whether it was outright. So, and then people asking you questions. When I was in college, I would walk across campus with my father, who was a professor, and sometimes he would hold my hand, and people would think that I was his girlfriend. And he actually got confronted by a graduate student about having an Asian girlfriend on campus. And he was like, "Do you mean my daughter?" She was really mortified. But that just shows you that everyone's assumptions, when you are of a certain race and a certain background, are going to interfere with your development of your relationship and dynamic with your own family, right? That people could perceive you as your father's girlfriend or your brother's girlfriend is a bizarre thing to experience.
Yeah, I can understand. Perception it's just sad, but understandable that you have to face something like that. And I'm sorry.
Oh, well, thank you. I was going to just say, I think my advice to people of color who are adopted is to seek out some of that culture that you're afraid of, because what you're afraid of is kind of yourself, right? What are you going to find out about yourself? So the more I leaned into knowing about Korean history, learning Korean food, I taught myself how to cook Korean food because I just thought it was so fascinating. And then I've taught myself how to cook Thai and Chinese food, right? It doesn't have to stop with just what your background is. But the idea is that you're open to experiences, and you're open to your individuality, and you're open to the fact that you have this unique, special, multiracial background that actually, I feel, represents the best of America. And I think there are ways to take pride in who we are and acknowledge the pain, acknowledge the difficulties, but also channel those into something more positive. And that's the type of work that I do with my clients. And I find that they really benefit from embracing their complexity and how special and unique their identity is.
I actually have a question for anyone, because you work with adoptees, but this is something that I've faced. So I went through a life of going to a doctor's office and not being able to fill out the forms because I didn't have the genetics. And nowadays you can go on and you can get some DNA testing done at 23andMe and all those. Has that made a difference in how people process that or learn about themselves? Have you found?
That's interesting. So I wound up doing the DNA test because my son asked me to. And I found it interesting, but I wasn't that curious. But it turns out I'm 99.9% Korean. I'm really, really, really necessarily Korean. I think that for some, it has allowed them to find out some of those answers more specifically about who they are. But for others, it has actually connected them to cousins and to people that they are related to. So for people who are actually seeking connection in biological family, I think it can be a really useful tool. But one of the things that reminds me of that I did want to say in answer to your question as well about adoptees who are of color is that I would seek out as well friends who are of diverse backgrounds. And it doesn't, right, I'm not going to find people exactly like me. It turns out my best friend is a Korean adoptee. We happened to meet and we became best friends. And that has helped me tremendously as well. But I also found myself in college and beyond surrounding myself with people from all different backgrounds. And that also helped really center me and who I was and how being different wasn't such a weird thing, and that it actually was kind of cool, and that we were all from these different places and we had so much to contribute. So for example, I'm married to a man who's Latino, and when we met 30 years ago, we've been married for 20 plus years. I'd never met a Latino before. I really hadn't. And I felt kind of silly. And he comes from an immigrant background. And we have built this, lovely family together, and we're very happy. But the idea that he has experienced something similar to what I've experienced growing up as a person of color, who happens to come from a privileged background, who happens to, right? We have a lot of similarities. But what I found was that you can find, I think, closeness and identity with other groups, even if they're not exactly like you, but to seek out people who have diverse backgrounds.
Have you found that people will go on to groups online, for example, for adoptees, that's helped people?
Absolutely. And the Latin American adoptee I told you guys about a little bit has found so much healing and so much community by finding a Facebook group that's specific to her ethnicity. She's also started her own podcast. She's also, right, started working with adoptee groups. I think that has helped her create for herself a place of pride. This is the same woman who her parents didn't want her to change her name. She's still working toward that in a way that she can be comfortable, but she's expanded her sense of who she is in a way that she can feel proud of. And I think that's the goal, right? For all of us.
Yeah.
This has been so comprehensive, and this is just such valuable information. I could talk to you all day. I really appreciate you sharing. And I think it's really, really helpful to prospective adoptive parents and adoptees and birth families to hear about these experiences and ways to help children form their positive identities, and also while accepting challenges with that and accepting that there will be challenges with that. I was wondering if you would be open to sharing different resources that our listeners can go to. Jessica, I know you mentioned a book too, and curious if we could add your information to our adoption competent resources as well.
To find me, it's at Jessica Ann Pressler, all across all social media, and jessicaannpressler.com is my website that has now 50 blogs plus more in the future on all different mental health, and I will have a few on adoption. Where my focus in my book that's coming out is not about adoption per se, but a big piece of it is that I was adopted, and that's written about in throughout the book. It's one of the reasons why I had issues in romantic relationships with abandonment issues. So that is definitely a theme that goes throughout the book. Book will be out by the end of the year.
One of the things that I think talking about what adoptive parents might want to be mindful of is in 2016, the US Department of Education released some statistics that were actually really alarming. And they just happened to be looking at this about 15,000 students, and they were looking at measures of academic issues, psychological issues, mental health issues. And so they were gathering all this data. And I thought it should be noted because I think a lot of adoptive parents, their kids are young and they're really just involved in the day-to-day of bringing up their kids. But just knowing that there is a very clear through line with adoptees, whether international or domestic, where they have shown clear patterns of academic problems, mental health issues, and they have been able to break it down by charts. And they show that adoptees beyond single parent homes and certainly married parent homes, that they are far and away suffering from potential learning disabilities, ADHD, mental health issues, anxiety. And so as we see these issues creep up for the entirety of this generation, right? And I'm sure Jessica is aware of the real problem that we have for this younger generation when it comes to anxiety and depression, that adoptees will have a special place in that, right? They're going to also be suffering, but they're going to have that extra layer, and they may not feel they have the resources. They may not feel they have the people to talk to, or have a counselor. So while I put together some of these resources for you guys, I do want everyone to remember that there are now real research statistics that show us that adoptees are having worse outcomes. And so that means that any kind of therapeutic attention or environmental, attention to these issues and to adoptees' particular needs is going to be really important.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and to both of you for not only sharing your stories, but the knowledge that you each have on the adoption triad, the adoption experience, and the ways that we can all help support each other, but particularly the adoptees in our lives that we work with every day. So we can't thank you both enough for everything that you've shared with us today.
Well, that was a very insightful conversation with Jessica and Jennifer. I appreciated that so much. I could talk to them for days and hear their experiences. And I'm so glad they were vulnerable with adoptee experiences. Elise, do you have a parting thought for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, listening specifically to Jessica's adoption story and the way that she found out she was adopted, and the fact that it took her family almost a decade, and really the feelings she had around that, it's just such an important reminder for adoptive parents to be creating a safe space for their children to not only share their adoption story, but to be able to ask questions about their adoption and about their birth family, and making sure that they're always just creating an environment where their children feel safe and feel like they can come and ask these questions and explore that part of them to really help develop their own identities, which is so important for every child. Nicole, what about you? Do you have any takeaways from the episode?
I like that you mentioned any child. I think our responsibility as parents, no matter how you came to parent, is to explore those themes of trauma and shame and insecurity and how we were raised, discipline, all of those things we talk about in a home study process, to be able to process those, to be the best parents that we can be to any child, but especially with the extra layer of adoption. I think that adds to the triad. So it gave me a lot to think about for sure.
Thank you so much to Jennifer and Jessica for such a great and insightful conversation. We know that this conversation is so important, and the information that you shared is so valuable for prospective and adoptive parents to hear.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us for another episode of Adoption and Beyond. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate, like, subscribe, share this podcast, all of the things with somebody who needs to hear this.
And if you have not already, please head over to our website at www.afth.org for more information on our services for pregnant people, prospective adopted parents, and professionals looking to learn more about adoption.
And if you'd like to learn more about Jessica and Jennifer, our guests today, we will have links to where you can find them in the description of this episode. Do not forget to order a copy of Jessica's book, The Traitor Within, coming out later this year, and check out Jennifer's website at Bloom Therapy. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to connecting with you again.